The city bus moved slowly through 5th and Madison, the headlights glowing against quiet sidewalks. It was nearly midnight. Streetlights flickered above like tired eyes trying to stay open. Inside, the bus was nearly silent. No passengers. Just the low hum of the engine, the soft rattle of loose change in the fare box, and the sound of the driver tapping the wheel with his fingers. He was a man in his late 40s, with tired eyes and a worn-out uniform that still somehow looked neat. His name badge was tucked just beneath a faded jacket. Most nights looked like this: empty seats, quiet roads, and a long list of stops with no one waiting. He cleared his throat. Then, almost without thinking, he started to hum. It was gentle at first, like a memory trying to return. Then the hum turned into something more a note than a phrase. Italian words, old and full of meaning, rose from his chest. He didn't force them. They came naturally, like air, like truth. Nessun dorma, he sang quietly. Then louder his voice rolled through the empty bus like thunder in a tunnel. Smooth and rich, strong but full of pain. The kind of voice you'd expect on a grand stage, not behind the wheel of a city bus. The notes hung in the air, wrapping around the handrails and empty seats. His eyes closed, his hands still steady. On the wheel, like he was somewhere else, somewhere far from late nights, paycheck worries and worn-out brakes. What he didn't know was that someone across the street, walking home from a late shift, had stopped. The woman held up her phone. Through the front window of the bus, she recorded the man singing like no one was listening. Back inside, the driver finished the aria with a quiet breath, almost like a prayer. He opened his eyes. Just another red light. Just another Tuesday. He didn't think anything of it. 3 stops later, he pulled into the small lot behind the depot. He gathered his things, checked the bus, and stepped off into the chilly night. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his daughter. "Dad, you need to see this." There was a link. A video posted just 30 minutes earlier from an account called Night Rider NYC. He tapped play, holding the phone close in the dim light. It was him. On the bus, singing. The video had already hit 50,000 views. The caption read, "Bus driver thinks no one's watching, wait for it." He watched, stunned, as the camera zoomed in on his facelip by the dashboard, eyes shut, voice soaring. The sound was clear. No echo, no edits. Just him and a moment that somehow felt bigger than anything he'd lived in years. The comments were flooding in, faster than he could read them. Who is this man? I'm crying. That voice, where's his record deal? This just gave me chills, but mixed in were others. Fake. Auto-tune? Bus drivers don't sing like that. He put the phone down, heart thudding. It felt unreal, like he'd just woken up from a dream and was still half inside it. He walked to the edge of the lot and looked out at the city lights. The streets felt different now, like something had shifted. Like the city was suddenly watching him. The buzz in his pockets started again. This time, it was a call. The screen said Transit Authority. He stared at it a moment before answering. "Can you come in tomorrow morning at 9? The voice said, "Is there a problem?" "Just be here at 9. They didn't sound angry. But they didn't sound pleased either. He ended the call and slid the phone into his pocket. Up above, a cold wind shook the leaves. The city hadn't changed. But something inside him had. Back in the depot, the other drivers were clocking out. Laughing, joking, getting on with their nights. But he felt quiet. A strange kind of quiet, the kind that comes right before a storm. He'd been driving this same route for 23 years. Same seat, same stops, same silence. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, someone had heard him, and the world, it seemed, had finally started to listen. By sunrise, the video had passed 100,000 views. He sat at his small kitchen table, a chipped mug of black coffee growing cold in his hands. His daughter scrolled through her phone, eyes wide, barely blinking. Every few seconds, she gasped or whispered, "Dad, look at this one," before reading another comment aloud. One said, I haven't cried like this in years. This man sings. Like he's been through something real. Another read, if this guy isn't at the Met by the end of the week, something is broken with the world. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't even told his daughter that he used to sing professionally, not the full story. She was just a baby when the dream slipped away, and the job behind the wheel became the only steady thing he could count on. You never told me you had a voice like that, she said, smiling through tears. I used to, he replied. Before life started charging rent. At exactly 9 a.m., he walked through the glass doors of the Transit Authority building. A guard at the front desk recognized him, smiled nervously, then quickly looked away. Something felt off. Everyone knew. They just didn't know what to do with it. He was told to wait in a gray-walled room on the third floor, no windows. Just humming lights and chairs that looked uncomfortable on purpose. 10 minutes later, a woman in a sharp suit walked in. Her face didn't show much. She had the kind of expression that never cracked. No matter what was happening around her, she didn't shake his hand. 17 million views, she said, tapping on her tablet. You've become quite the ... spectacle. Overnight, I was between passengers, he said calmly. The bus was empty. That's not the issue, she replied. You were in uniform in a city vehicle, performing for the internet. I wasn't performing, he said. I was singing. I've been doing that for years when no one's around. She looked up. For the first time, something flickered. In her eyes, not understanding, just calculation. Before he could say more, the door opened again. A man in a charcoal gray suit stepped inside, younger than expected, with a polished smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. This is Mr. Chun, she said. He's from the mayor's office. The man stepped forward, extended his hand. We've been getting a lot of calls. The mayor's office is aware of your situation. My situation? The driver asked. Chun smiled again, more like a news anchor than someone real. This kind of attention, while impressive, isn't exactly helpful to the city's image. We're currently dealing with budget issues, labor negotiations, public scrutiny. The last thing we need is a viral sensation turning into a distraction. The driver stared at him. A distraction? He said softly. We prefer our employees to do their jobs, not chase the spotlight, the woman added, her voice a little firmer now. He let the silence hang. Then finally he nodded once, slowly. I see, he said. You don't want people thinking someone like me has something worth hearing. That's not what we're saying, she began, but he stood before she could finish. I've driven your buses for 23 years. He said, rain, snow, broken heat, broken a sea. I've never been late, never had a complaint. I know every stop, every shortcut, every person on my route by face. You never once asked what else I could do. But the minute the world hears me, you panic. Because it didn't come from where you expected. The woman looked at him like she was trying to decide if she was being insulted. Are you refusing to comply with the investigation? I'm telling you, he said, that I've been invisible for a long time, and you liked it that way. They suspended him 2 weeks without pay. Just like that. A form signed. A copy handed to him. He was told not to speak to the media. He walked out of the building into a wall of flashing cameras. Someone shouted his name. He looked up. He didn't answer right away. But then, as the microphones crowded closer, he said quietly, calmly, They told me I'm suspended. For singing, for making people feel something real. Refusing to stay quiet, it was all the camera needed. A clip barely 10 seconds long. But by the time he got back to his apartment, it was everywhere. His face, his words, his silence. Before speaking, the internet took that moment and ran with it. Justice for the bus driver started trending by nightfall. Musicians, actors, teachers, students, they all began to post their own stories. Stories of being overlooked, ignored, underestimated. He didn't know what to make of it. He still felt like the same man. Still had bills to pay. still had a route map burned into his memory like the back of his hand, but something had changed. And it wasn't just the numbers. The world had heard him. No, it wasn't just a video dot, it was a question. How many other voices were we not hearing? He didn't sleep that night. The city outside his apartment kept moving sirens in the distance, buses hissing down rain-slicked streets, but for him, everything had gone still. He sat by the window, staring at the screen in his hand, watching. The numbers tick up like a slow heartbeat dot by sunrise. The video had hit 10 million. His daughter came out of her room, blankets still wrapped around her shoulders, hair a mess, eyes wide. "Dad," she said softly, "you're everywhere." She wasn't wrong. His face had been on the late-night news, shared by celebrities, quoted by journalists. The words he'd spoken outside the Transit Authority building, "I was punished for refusing to stay invisible," had become a rallying cry. Someone printed it on t-shirts. Someone else made it into a song dot by breakfast. He was a symbol. Not just of a man with a beautiful voice, but of something deeper, of all the people walking this world with gifts that had gone unseen for years. Outside his building, reporters began to gather. Neighbors peeked through blinds. One woman from 3 floors up knocked on his door just to say, "My mother cried when she heard you sing." He thanked her. He didn't know what else to say. The Transit Authority, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Their statement, short and stiff, said only that protocol was being followed, and that personal activity during duty hours would not be tolerated. It didn't land the way they wanted. People weren't buying it. Instead, more stories started pouring in. A janitor who played classical piano in his church for 30 years. A high school cafeteria worker who painted oil portraits in secret. A train conductor who wrote novels on his lunch break but had never told a soul. One comment stood out among the thousands, flooding his feed. How many lives are hiding brilliance? Behind uniforms we never look past. He wasn't alone. That's what hit him hardest. It wasn't just about his voice anymore. It was about the millions of people who'd been told to stay in their lane, to do their jobs quietly, to shrink themselves so the world could stay comfortable, but not everyone was cheering. Some voices loud, bitter, called him an attention seeker, a troublemaker. They accused him of playing the race card, claimed he was trying to get rich off pity. One post read, "So now we're giving opera contracts to bus drivers. What's next, baristas conducting orchestras?" He read that one twice, not because it hurt, but because it proved something. Some people just couldn't handle it when the world stopped following the script, but there were others, more powerful ones, who were listening. On the 3rd day, he got a call from someone he didn't expect. Quiet voice on the line said, "My name is David Kim. I am with the Metropolitan Opera. I watched your video, and I'd like to speak with you in person." He didn't know how to answer at first. He looked at the phone like it might disappear. "You don't owe me anything," the man said kindly. "You don't even have to say yes. But I want you to know we see you." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even an offer, not yet. It was something more important, an invitation. They met the next afternoon in a small cafe off Columbus Avenue. The man from the Met was young, well-dressed, and didn't talk like he was better than anyone. He didn't lead with contracts or fame. He didn't mention views or algorithms. He started with a question. When was the last time you sang for yourself? Not in the quiet. Not when no one was watching, but like it mattered? The bus driver sat still for a long time. 25 years ago, he said. "The day I walked out of my last voice lesson and into a job interview." Kim nodded slowly. "I'd like to hear you sing in a space built for it," he said. "Not a bus, not a phone camera, a real hall, with real acoustics. If that's something you'd be willing to try." He agreed. Not out of excitement, but out of something. Heavier. Hope that maybe it wasn't too late. Hope that maybe he hadn't been wrong all those years ago when he believed his voice meant something. When he walked out of the cafe, the city didn't feel the same. The sidewalks buzzed with whispers. Strangers waved. Kids asked for selfies. Someone passed by humming Nessun Dorma under their breath. But what struck him most wasn't the noise. It was the way people looked at him now. Not like a driver. Not like a headline. Like a man who had reminded them of something they'd almost forgotten, that beauty still matters. That talent can live anywhere. That the most extraordinary voices often come from the most ordinary places. He looked up at the buildings. The buses, the trains rushing by. Then he smiled to himself, and for the first time in a long time, he sang out loud on the street and people stopped to listen. The doors of a Metropolitan Opera weren't like the ones he was used to. They didn't slide open with a squeak. They didn't smell like diesel fuel or carry the hum of tired passengers and city noise. These doors were heavy, polished, handled with care. And as he stepped through them for the first time in decades, the world behind him, the world of fare, cards and transit schedules suddenly felt a million miles away. He was dressed in his best shirt, the same one he wore to church on Easter Sunday. A tie borrowed from his neighbor 2 doors down. It was too tight at the collar, but he didn't mind. He just wanted to look like someone who belonged. Even if deep down he still wasn't sure he did. David Kim met him at the entrance. He offered a small nod and a quiet smile that somehow eased the knot in his chest. No cameras, no crowds. Just 2 men walking side by side through a temple built for voices. They passed framed portraits of legends' names he remembered from old record covers, faces he'd studied in college before the dream was shelved and boxed up. He never imagined he'd be walking these halls again, especially not as a guest. Especially not like this. They stopped outside a rehearsal room. Behind the thick doors, someone was playing scales on a grand piano. Kim turned to him. No pressure. He said, "This isn't an audition. Not yet. Just show us who you are." Inside, the room was large and bare, except for the piano, a stool, and a woman standing by the far wall. She introduced herself as Maria Santos, the Met's artistic director. Her name rang a bell. He'd seen her in interviews, always calm, always sharp. "I've watched your video more than a dozen times," she said. "And not once did I think of you as just a bus driver." He gave a small nod, unsure how to respond. Then she asked, "What would you like to sing?" He didn't hesitate. "Old Man River," he said. "It's been sitting in my chest for a long time." They nodded and the accompanist began to play. The moment the first note left his mouth, the room changed. He didn't sing like someone trying to impress. He sang like someone finally letting go. Every note carried weight, years of silence. Decades of overlooked talent, morning shifts in the cold. Long nights when the city didn't even notice him. Maria and Kim stood frozen. They weren't just listening to a voice. They were watching a man reclaim his purpose. When he finished, there was silence. A full minute of stillness. Then Maria stepped forward. "Do you know Nessun Dorma?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "It's the one that brought all of this here, isn't it?" And so he sang again, not in a bus, not caught by accident, but fully present. His voice rose high, steady, and unafraid. It filled the room like light spilling into darkness. This time, it wasn't a hidden gift. It was a declaration. After the final note, he looked down at the floor. He couldn't read their faces. Then Maria said quietly, "Would you be willing to join us as an understudy? You'll train with our vocal coaches. We'll pay you full time. You'll be on stage within the year." He looked up. Not because he didn't hear her, but because he didn't think he ever would. "I would," he said. "But only if I can still drive my route, 1 day a week." Kim raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He shrugged. "That bus. It's part of who I am. The people on it, they're my first audience. I don't want to forget where I started." They agreed. That very moment. Back at the transit authority, chaos was blooming. Catherine Walsh, the woman who had suspended him, was in a closed-door meeting with the board. She wore her usual gray blazer and tight-lipped expression, but her eyes flicked constantly to the phone buzzing on the table. Media requests, angry emails, sponsors pulling funding. Something was unraveling fast, and she could feel it. The board wasn't smiling. One member laid a tablet in front of her. "You've become a PR disaster," he said flatly. "This was a routine disciplinary action," Walsh replied, trying to stay firm. Another board member cut in. "No, it was a mistake that exposed something bigger, and now we're getting complaints from drivers, from community leaders, even from the mayor's office." Walsh swallowed hard. Across the room, a younger member cleared her throat. "We've also received documentation," she said. "Years of ignored promotion requests. Drivers with perfect records passed over, mostly Black and Latino. Your name's on nearly all of them." Walsh opened her mouth but had no words. What she considered routine operations were now being reviewed as patterns. As possible discrimination, and it all started with one man, one song, one moment when a person stopped being invisible. Later, that day he got another call. This time, it wasn't from a stranger. It was from a driver he hadn't spoken to in years. "You gave us a voice, brother," the man said. "And now they're scared of what we might say." That night, as he returned to his apartment, there were people outside. Not reporters this time, neighbors, coworkers, singers, students. They clapped when they saw him. Someone handed him a bouquet of flowers. Another asked for an autograph. He stood there, stunned. This wasn't the stage. This wasn't the Met, but it mattered just as much. And deep down, he understood something he never had before. The real audience had always been the people who saw him every day, and now, finally, they were seeing him fully. The first time he stepped onto the Metropolitan Opera's main stage, the lights weren't even on. No audience, no orchestra. Just rows of empty red velvet seats and silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. He stood still for a moment, looking out over the vast hall. The echoes of history lived in these walls. People had stood right where he was now, people trained since childhood, born into music, shaped by teachers and traditions. He hadn't sung here in some past life. He'd driven a city bus, yet somehow he was here, the rehearsal pianist. A gentle woman with salt and pepper hair and a wry smile waved him forward. She tapped a few keys. "Start whenever you're ready," she said. He nodded. And then he sang. No cameras, no internet, just his voice, honest, open, and trembling with decades of weight. He didn't sing like a polished performer. He sang like a man who had fought to be heard, who had bled into every lyric. His voice cracked once, and he didn't hide it. He leaned into it because he wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to feel alive. From the wings, David Kim watched quietly, arms folded. Maria Santos stood beside him. She whispered, "He doesn't sing like he's trying to be perfect. He sings like he remembers why music was made." Kim just nodded. Later that afternoon, Marcus, that name never spoken now, as you requested, sat in a practice room across from Professor Elena Vulov, the Mets' toughest vocal coach. She studied him like a sculptor sizes up raw stone. "You breathe too shallow," she said in a thick Russian accent. "You grip the notes like you're afraid they'll leave you." But she paused, leaning in. "Your soul," she said softly. "That part is perfect." He smiled for the first time that day. Not because she praised him, but because she saw him. The real him. Each day after that, he trained like he was preparing for war. Morning warm-ups, language coaching, posture corrections. He stood for hours at the mirror, fixing things he didn't know were broken vowel placement, jaw tension, even how to hold his hands while singing. By the end of the week, his back ached and his throat burned, but he had never felt more alive, and he still drove his route. Once a week, on Wednesday mornings, he showed up at the depot before sunrise, uniform clean, cap tilted just right. His regular passengers were waiting old women with grocery bags, students with backpacks, night shift workers just heading home. The moment they stepped on, something changed. They didn't just nod or smile, they listened. When he sang over the intercom softly at first, people stopped what they were doing. Phones lowered. Conversations paused. The city held its breath. One man filmed it, Posted it. It went viral again. From the Met to the M60, he hasn't forgotten where he came from. That video exploded just as the transit authorities' internal investigation reached its boiling point. Inside their downtown office, Catherine Walsh sat in a conference room surrounded by members of the board. They weren't angry. They were furious. A young staffer entered the room and handed her a thick folder printed emails, statements from former drivers, charts showing a clear pattern of discrimination stretching back years. "You've made us vulnerable," one board member said coldly. "And worse, you've made us national news." Across the country, city governments were reviewing their policies, holding emergency meetings. Other transit workers were coming forward. In Atlanta, a mechanic shared videos of himself playing Beethoven flawlessly on a battered piano in his garage. In Chicago, a ticket clerk who could recite Shakespeare from memory was suddenly being offered theater auditions. What had started with one man had turned into a wave. Movement. The idea that brilliance could come from anywhere was no longer just inspiring, it was undeniable, and it terrified people like Catherine Walsh. At home, Marcus' daughter read an article out loud while they ate dinner. New York's most unlikely opera star is now being called the voice that cracked a system. Wide open. He looked at her, half smiling. "That's a bit much, don't you think?" "No," she said. "It's not." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You're not just singing for you anymore. You're singing for everyone who never got the chance." He nodded quietly. And that night, for the first time in over 2 decades, he took out the old program from his conservatory graduation, the one he'd folded neatly and kept at the bottom of a drawer all these years. He ran his fingers over the names, the photos, the roles he never got to play, and then he whispered something to himself. "I'm not done yet." The velvet curtain hung heavy like a secret waiting to be revealed. Backstage, voices moved in hushed tones. Crew members adjusted sets with quiet precision, and the hum of 1,000 expectant whispers floated from beyond the doors. The house was full, more than 3,000 seats, all taken. Critics in tuxedos, donors in diamonds, fans in the nosebleeds who had seen his face not in concert halls, but on city buses. He stood just behind the wings, wrapped in the heavy costume of Otello, General of Venice, warrior, tragic soul. The leather breastplate pressed against his chest, but it wasn't the armor making it hard to breathe. He wasn't supposed to be here tonight. The lead tenor had fallen ill, some kind of infection that knocked him out hours before curtain. The Met had 2 backups on paper. One was out of town. The other, newly suspended for disciplinary reasons, which left only one name. His. David. Kim had pulled him aside less than 2 hours ago. "You don't have to do this," Kim said. "We'll understand. But if you want it, it's yours." He hadn't answered right away. His hands had been shaking, not from fear, but from everything this meant. 20-5 years of silence. 1 viral video. 2 weeks of suspension. And now, center stage. He stood in the wings, costume tight, throat dry. Professor Valov was beside him, her tiny frame still somehow powerful, still watching him like a hawk. "Remember," she said, touching her chest, "technique supports the emotion. But the emotion is why they listen." His daughter sat in the 3rd row, wearing a borrowed dress and gripping the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles were white. Just behind her were his regular bus passengers, the woman with grocery bags, the college kid who always gave up his seat for elders, the man who worked the night shift at the hospital and never said much, but always nodded when he got off. They were dressed in their finest clothes, not because someone told them to, but because this was their moment too. The lights dimmed, the orchestra began, and the curtain rose. He stepped onto the stage. For a heartbeat, he forgot everything. Then the music carried him. He didn't try to be perfect, he tried to be honest. And it worked. His Otello wasn't clean, but it was raw. His voice trembled at the start, but it steadied with each word. When he sang of love, he meant it. When he sang of betrayal, it came from somewhere deeper than rehearsal. The audience leaned in, not because he was flawless, but because he was human Dot in an opera. That's everything Dot at one point. During Otello's grief-filled farewell, he faltered. One note a high one wavered. His voice cracked. Dot, he froze. A lifetime of habit told him to pull back, to play it safe, but then he remembered the empty bus, the dashboard lights, the echo of his own voice in the dark. He let the crack stay. Let it break open the aria. Dot, and the crowd felt it. The orchestra adjusted to him, followed his timing, his pain, his truth. And when the aria ended, there was a silence so deep, it shook him more than any applause could. Backstage, Maria Santos watched from the wings with glassy eyes. He's not performing, she whispered. He's living it. The final act came, Otello's. Death. Dot, and as he sank to the stage floor, whispering his last broken confession, it wasn't just the character dying. Dot, it was every moment he'd ever believed he had no place on the stage. When the curtain fell, the room went quiet. Dot, then came the applause. Dot, it started soft, uncertain. Dot, then it grew. Dot, and grew, until the walls shook with it. 12 minutes. That's how long they clapped. People stood, shouted, cried. Some tossed flowers onto the stage. Others just stood, hands over their mouths, unable to speak. He stood, slowly, bowed deeply. Dot, and wept. Dot, behind him. The cast embraced him like one of their own. David Kim whispered, "You just changed everything." But it wasn't until he stepped off stage and saw his daughter waiting, tears on her cheeks, pride in her eyes, that he understood what had just happened. He hadn't just sung at the Met. He had broken a wall that had stood too long. Dot, later that night, while still in costume, he sat quietly in his dressing room. The door opened and his old regular Eleanor, the woman with the grocery bags, walked in with her hands clasped tight around a little gift bag. "I don't have much," she said, "but I wanted you to have this." Inside was a tiny angel, figurine, hand-painted and chipped at the wings. "I bought this years ago. Didn't know why. Now I do." He hugged her. He couldn't find words. And outside, the city that once rode past him with barely a glance, now waited for him, not as a driver. Dot, not just as a voice, but as someone who had reminded them all that greatness doesn't need permission. 1 year later, he stood in front of the United States Congress, not in costume, not in uniform, just a simple gray suit and the same clear voice that once echoed off the windows of a near-empty bus. The chamber was packed. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, artists, advocates, teachers, students. His daughter sat in the gallery next to Eleanor, the woman with grocery bags who had become like family. Behind them sat musicians from the Metropolitan Opera, his vocal coach, even drivers from his old depot, all of them witnesses to the moment. He took a breath and spoke into the microphone. "I'm here today not because I'm special." He said, "I'm here because my story isn't." He paused as murmurs rolled through the chamber. "I sang on a city bus because it was the only place left that felt like mine. I wasn't chasing fame. I was remembering who I was." They listened, really listened, not because he was famous now, but because his voice carried something rare in politics, truth. "The real tragedy," he said, "is not that I drove a bus for 23 years while I had a voice trained for opera. The tragedy is how many others are out there with gifts we never notice. Not because they're not talented, but because we're not looking." There were nods. Some lawmakers blinked back emotion. Others looked stunned. His testimony was the final step before Congress passed what would become known as the Williams Act, a bill requiring blind promotion processes in government agencies and creating funding for arts access in underserved communities. The bill passed with overwhelming support. It was signed into law 3 weeks later, and yet, through all the national headlines, all the praise and interviews and fanfare, his life never drifted far from where it started. Every Wednesday morning, he still drove bus 47. Same route. Same stops. Not out of habit, but purpose. Because for That bus was never just a vehicle. It was a stage, a classroom, a confession booth, a sanctuary. It was where he first let his soul breathe out loud. One particular Wednesday, he picked up a quiet young woman humming to herself at the back of the line. Her face was half hidden beneath a hoodie, but her voice, soft, shy, trembling, carried just enough melody to stop him mid-motion. He glanced in the mirror. "You wrote that?" he asked gently over the intercom. She froze, then nodded. A week later, that young woman, Jessica, stood before the New York Philharmonic performing her original composition, introduced by the same man who had once been told to stay invisible. "This," he said to the audience that night, "is what happens when you let people be heard." Meanwhile, across the city, the former Transit Authority director, Catherine Walsh, sat in a quiet office in a nonprofit. After her resignation, she disappeared from the spotlight. But she didn't vanish. Instead, she wrote a piece in the New York Times titled, "The Manager Who Almost Silenced an Angel." It was part apology, part confession. She admitted to fostering a system that punished talent it couldn't categorize. The piece went viral in its own right, sparking uncomfortable and necessary conversations. In boardrooms and break rooms alike, she never asked for forgiveness. But she did begin again. Her new role focused on helping returning citizens, those formerly incarcerated, find jobs, housing, and hope. It was hard work, humbling, but healing too. She sent one letter after that, addressed to him, not to explain, not to justify, just to say thank you. Thank you for showing her a better way to lead. He never responded, but he read it more than once. The Metropolitan Opera kept their promise. After his breakout performance as Otello, he was given full season roles. He sang in Paris, in Berlin, and Tokyo, but he always returned home. He turned down movie deals and endorsement offers. But he said yes to one thing, a program of his own, the Voice in the City project. Fleet of buses converted into mobile art classrooms, traveling across the country to low-income neighborhoods, shelters, and rural towns. Each one staffed with artists, musicians, poets, some famous, most not, all united by one goal: to remind people they mattered, to remind them they had a voice, and that voice deserved to be heard. One evening, he stood outside a converted bus parked in a schoolyard in Detroit. Inside, a dozen kids were learning to write lyrics over piano chords. Outside, parents waited, some skeptical, some curious. One father looked at him and asked, "Why do you care so much?" He thought about it, then said softly, "Because someone listened to me when I didn't even know I was speaking." He smiled, and the man nodded. Back in New York, on the night of the anniversary of his first Met performance, the Opera House dimmed its lights and held a free concert open to everyone. City workers, subway musicians, former students, construction crews, janitors, nurses, the invisible backbone of the city, were seated front and center. He performed again. But this time, when he finished, he didn't bow alone. He invited them all, the singers, the drivers, the grocery clerks who sang in choirs, the school janitor who wrote jazz in his free time, onto the stage. As the crowd rose in applause, he looked out over the room and thought of a night he sang alone on an empty bus. That night, no one had clapped. No one had watched. Except one woman with a phone. Except the universe. And now this. He didn't need the spotlight anymore. He'd already found what he was looking for. Not fame, not redemption, but the sound of people finally being heard. He walked off stage into the night, phone buzzing in his pocket. A message from Eleanor. "Don't forget. Bus 47 picks up at 6 a.m. Your people are waiting." He laughed softly, slipped the phone away, and headed home. Because some journeys, the ones that matter, are worth taking again and again. Sometimes the road that seems the smallest leads to the biggest stage of all.